Okay, welcome back. So today is our last day of discussing problems of personal identity. After this class, the remaining weeks will be devoted to questions in epistemology, questions about knowledge. What do we know? How do we know? How might we know that we know? And so on. I think it's a really interesting batch of questions, so I really look forward to the coming weeks. But first we're going to see what we can't do by way of ending up with an adequate psychological account of personal identity. So this is where Lewis comes in. But quick announcement. You should all know that you've got an assessment task coming due. If you haven't begun, begin sometime soon. All right. So by way of review. I do these review things in this section because there's just a lot going on. There's a lot of different arguments. There's a lot of different positions. And it's important to keep in mind the dialectic, the back and forth. All right, so where do we start out? We start out with the psychological view, Locke's psychological view. Right? We had our question, what makes me the same person as the person who entered this room and as the person who will leave? Locke's got a pretty plausible answer, an answer that can, in fact, explain that particular question. And a load of other things as well. For example, we just take it to be a fact that we continue to exist, although our bodies might change significantly over time. We can very easily call to mind, and seemingly unproblematically, call to mind possible, not realistic, but again, broadly possible scenarios where people switch bodies or two people occupy the same body. And Locke's view just can explain all this stuff. And in general, when you got a view that can explain a lot of stuff, you've got non-trivial reason to endorse the view. But there are problems for that psychological view, or the broad family of psychological views. One major problem has to do with fission cases. In fission cases, you've got one individual who splits off into two and is psychologically continuous with the original. So you've got one person who breaks off into multiple persons. Identity is supposed to be a transitive relation. So if one person is psychologically continuous with two, then they have to be the same person. But they can't be the same person on the psychological view, because they're not psychologically continuous with each other. Last class, we saw another pressure point for psychological views. Williams asks us to consider a variety of circumstances in which it would seem appropriate to fear for oneself. You're told that tomorrow you'll be tortured. You fear. You're told that tomorrow you'll be tortured, but you'll forget being told that right now. You still fear. You're told that tomorrow you'll be tortured, but your mind's going to be messed with severely so that you lose your memories. Your character changes. You believe you're someone fictional, or maybe you even believe you're someone realistic. Still, knowing that your body will be tortured tomorrow, you fear. But wait a second. If the psychological view's right, fear would be completely inappropriate. Because on the psychological view, once you cease to have memories, once your character drastically changes, once that much disruption occurs to your mental life, you cease to exist. You will not be the person in the body who's being tortured. Right? That's somebody else. And you don't have reason to fear the torture of somebody else. You might have reason to feel sad about that, wish it didn't happen, and other things. But you're not fearing for yourself, or you shouldn't be fearing for yourself. So Williams puts pressure on the psychological view. Are there any questions about Williams' argument that you'd like to ask before we go on? Okay. And then we saw teleportation cases, right? These also pose problems for psychological views. Because in teleportation, right, here's how it goes. You go into a box, it scans you, and then it annihilates your body. Now, the scan's transmitted elsewhere, and a replica's made. So in the psychological view, because there's something that's psychologically continuous with you, you continue to exist. You don't die. But this just seems to be quite similar to William's case, right? This is a way of dying. Or excuse me, I shouldn't say quite similar to William's case. It's similar in this respect. You should fear entering that box, because you will die. But wait a second, you shouldn't fear anything, because you don't die on the psychological view. So again, problems for the psychological view. Now we looked at, very briefly, an alternative. And the alternative said this: scrub the psychological stuff, right? Let's just think of personal identity this way. What makes you the same person as the person who entered this room and the person who will leave is this. The person who entered and you sitting here now and the person who will leave, first of all, are all persons, right? You all have beliefs and hopes and other stuff that make you a person, other psychological stuff. But you also have the same body, right? Your body is, call it biologically or physically continuous with the body that entered this room and the body that will leave this room. All right, so that's not bad, and that does a good job dealing with teleportation cases, because in teleportation cases, your body's destroyed, so, right? You cease to exist on this view. And in William's case, it gives the right answer, because your body is the body being tortured, and the person being tortured has a body that's biologically or physically continuous with the body that was informed that it would be tortured earlier on. Right? So biological view does well there. But recall last time we observed that just as there are fission cases for the mind, there are fission cases for the body. So if, right, you can just imagine your body, just imagine it being cut in two, right? And there's some way of preserving the functionality of each. Right, so your heart's cut in half, right, just down the middle, but everything still works well enough that you survive. And then both halves of you go on to live lives. Or suppose some other half is sewn on, right, something like that. Imagine the scenario you like. You can just have two halves splitting off that are biologically continuous and also persons. And yet we're going to run into a transitivity problem, because now you've got two, and by the biological view, the two have to be the same person. But wait, there are two people. So just as there are fission problems for the psychological view, there are fission problems for the biological view. And so at this point, you might be thinking, gee whiz, maybe Parfit's right. Maybe sometimes, like in fission cases, there's just no good answer to the question, do I survive? Right? There's just no question about not do I survive. There's no good answer to the question, who am I? Right? There's no good answer to the question of personal identity. But wait, that's not so bad, says Parfit, because you survive, right? You don't cease to exist. Right? It's not like teleportation where you're zapped, intuitively dead. You continue on, right? You continue on in a very different way than normally you continue on, but you continue on. Okay. There's pressure to put on Parfit, though, and there may be a way of saving the psychological view. All right, so this is the promise of Lewis. All right, so we'll find ourselves at this point. Now, maybe Parfit's right, but maybe there's also a way of saving the psychological view. Okay. So Lewis tosses a question back at Parfit. Parfit says what matters is survival, not identity. But Lewis says, what matters in survival? Right? So suppose some big event's coming up, a fight, a brain surgery. something potentially very disruptive to your life. You're wondering, will I survive this big event? Lewis asks, well, what matters? What do you care about? If you could pick an ideal world, or at least pick the best of possible ideal worlds, how would things end up? Well, Lewis says, here are two answers, and two intuitively correct ones, right? First of all, one thing that really matters to us is psychological continuity. Right? You don't want to find yourself on the other side of a brain surgery not remembering your friends and family. You don't want to be on the other side of a brain surgery being very easily angered and so not able to make friends in the future. Right? You don't want a Phineas Gage situation. Right? You don't want your character to change so dramatically that people kind of abhor you now. Right? You're foul and vulgar and generally unpleasant to be around, right? You want there to be continuity. You want the person on the other side of the brain surgery to be a whole lot like you psychologically, right? You want that person to have your memories, your hopes, your fears, your desires, so on. Psychological continuity is very important to us. But that's not all we care about, says Lewis. Not only do we want the person on the other end of the big event to be psychologically continuous with us, we want it to be us, right? You want to be on the other end of that big event. You want to be them, right? You don't want to disappear from the world via the event. Right? You want to continue on. This is just another way of saying what matters in survival is identity, right? And this is what Parfit denies. This is what Parfit denies. And Parfit denies it because he thinks you can't have both. You can't have it both ways in some instances. Right? In fission cases, you can't have both. So you have to pick one. All right. But Lewis says, you're moving too fast, Parfit. You're moving too fast. You can have both. You can have both. All right. Now, why can't you have both? Well, here's why. Right? Here's the reasoning in support of Parfit's view. Okay. First of all, psychological continuity. Right? It's got logical features that are incompatible with an identity relation. Right? Psychological continuity is a one-many relationship. Right? That's to say, right, this guy here, pre-fission, is psychologically continuous with multiple individuals, right? It's one many. Right? But personal identity can't be like that. Identity is one. If A is identical to B, and you've got A and B in a room, how many people are in the room, right? Just one. Identity is a one-one relation, right? Not so with psychological continuity. Psychological continuity admits of degree, right? Remember how we were talking about in brain fission cases? Suppose half the memories go one way, half the other, right? Even though you're going to get psychological continuity between pre-brain split and post-brain split persons, even though you're going to get psychological continuity between them, it's going to be diminished over time, right? But identity does not admit it of degree. It's not, you can't be more or less identical to something. Superman is either identical to Clark Kent or he's not. He's not kind of identical, right? If, I don't know, it just doesn't make sense, right? If two things are identical, there's just one thing, and you're either identical or not. So, like breaking the law is like this. You've either broken the law or you haven't, or at least a well-written law. You've either broken it or you've not. You've not kind of broken a law. Right? And additionally, transitivity fails in fission cases. Right? So even though pre-brain split is the same person as this, and pre-brain split is the same person as this, A and B are not the same person, right? They're distinct. Right? So that's going to be a failure of transitivity. But you can never have failures of transitivity with identity. Right? Identity is a transitive relation. If Superman's identical to Clark Kent's identical to the person loved by Lois Lane, then Superman's identical to the person loved by Lois Lane. That always holds. All right, so it's deeply puzzling how you can have psychological continuity explaining survival and yet say what matters in survival is personal identity when the two have to come apart in a range of cases, namely fission cases. Any questions about the differences here between these two relations? Great. So an alternative to Parfit's view, all right, you might just go the route of despair. Right? We began asking this question. Well, you walked into this room, you're sitting here now, you're going to leave. It's you all the way through. Well, you might say, given all these logical problems, maybe things are kind of bad, right? There's no facts about identity over time, because nothing is identical over time, right? The you who entered is not the same in any relevant sense as the person who will exit. And then there's antecedents to this in the history of philosophy. Heraclitus is known for his neat phrase, you can't cross the same river twice. Why? Well, even if you end up in the same general geographical region, it's a whole different body of water you're crossing, right? It's just a whole different thing you're interacting with, it seems. There's no identity for rivers. Buddhism has this embedded in it, and even more recently in modern philosophy, David Hume is known for denying personal identity over time. But still, this is a place to end up, right? It's not a place to begin. Or at least what we want to know is there any coherent way of maintaining that we exist over time? Right? And maybe not. Maybe at the end of the day, we have to end up somewhere over here, or at the very least, somewhere in the neighborhood of Parfit. But maybe not, right? This is what Lewis puts forward for us. So, how does Lewis do this? Well, he has us recall four-dimensionalism, right? There's a couple views of time. All right, there's the presentist view that only the present exists. And the presentist says that the past no longer exists, the future does not yet exist, there's only now. But the four-dimensionalist tells a different story. The four-dimensionalist says all moments of time are equally real. There is the moment of time of you entering this room. There is the moment of time of you sitting down. There is the moment of time of you exiting. All moments of time are there. And this gives rise to a couple ways of thinking about identity over time. So, a view that really naturally fits with presentism is called endurantism. And the endurantist thinks that people exist at various points of time, or that is, they persist through time, by being wholly present at every moment of time at which they exist. So here's the kind of picture. Bob exists at different points in time, but he's wholly present at each. Right? As time progresses, he's there. The whole him is there at each point. Right? The endurantist says at any given point in time where you find a person, they're all there. Right? They're not this temporally extended thing. You just have the whole person, and they're there at every moment in time in which they exist. The perdurantist, right? So this is the view that fits with the four-dimensionalist picture. The perdurantist looks out on the world, says it's a four-dimensionalist kind of situation, and individuals are just collections of all their temporal parts. So you'll recall this is how we dealt with the identity problem for time travel, Spock and Spock, right? What you are is just a collection of all your temporal parts. You're a collection of all your temporal parts. Okay, so two different views. All right, so just to reiterate, to get it in your minds, all right, so the perdurantist says that a person exists at different times, just in case they have different temporal parts located at all those times. Right. And the whole person is an aggregate of all their parts. All right. So let me pause here. How are you with the difference between endurantism and perdurantism? Right, one fits really well with the presentist view. The other fits really well with the four-dimensionalist view. Okay. All right. So, Lewis, right, he's a perdurantist. So he thinks persons are just aggregates of all their parts, right? They're the whole shebang, the whole enchilada, all of them. Now we have to ask a question, right? If you've got all these parts, well, what makes them all parts of you, right? What unites them into one? Why is it the case that the person that came from your mom oh so long ago is a part of you and not a part of the person sitting next to you? What makes that earlier person part of you and not part of someone else? Well, he gives a psychological view, right? He's defending the psychological picture. Right, it's psychological continuity. Now, we ask a further question with regard to person parts or person stages. Right, stages are just parts. When are two distinct person stages of the same person? Well, again, you get the same answer, right? This is a psychological view. What unites all the parts is psychological continuity. And when you ask a question about two individual parts and whether or not they're part of the same person, you're going to get the same answer. They're both parts of the same person, just in case they're both related by appropriate psychological relations. So memory, hopes, desires, intentions, right? So long as the psychology tracks. All right, so when we ask questions about identity, there's sometimes an ambiguity. And there's definitely an ambiguity when you ask questions of identity on a perdurantist view. Right, so you can ask, is A the same person as B? And on one reading, this is a question about the whole person. Right? When you ask, is Clark Kent the same person as Superman, you're asking a question about the whole person, right? Is the person named by Clark Kent the same person who gets the name Superman? Right. And on the perdurantist view, the answer is yes, but only if this condition obtains. Everything that's a part of Superman is a part of Clark Kent. They're the same person only if they have all the same parts. If there's any part that's different between them, right, a part had by one but not by the other, they're not the same person, right, because they're a different collection of parts. So you might think about two Lego structures, and maybe you have left structure and right structure, and they're individuals, and they're clasping hands, right? So you ask the question, is one the same as the other? Well, the answer is no, because there's all sorts of parts that are not shared between them. Right? They don't have all the same parts, so it can't be the same structure, even though they have some overlapping parts, some shared parts, right? The parts where their hands connect. But that's not the only kind of question we ask when we ask identity questions, and especially on the perdurantist view. Sometimes you can ask a question, is A the same person as B? But the question isn't about whole individuals. It's about individual stages, individuals' parts, person stages. So we can ask, is Phineas Gage after the accident the same person as Phineas Gage before the accident? And this isn't a question about the whole person. It's a question about parts of the person. And obviously, given that we asked the question in the way that we did, before accident, after accident, it's obvious what the answer is going to be. The answer is going to be no, they're not the same person. In a literal sense, even if they were psychologically continuous and very much, even if they were not just continuous, but virtually the same, because one exists before the accident and the other exists after, they can't be the same, right? They exist at different times, right? So they're going to be different, because every part is located at a time. But then there's another way of answering the question, where the answer is clearly yes. But the question interpreted in the way needed for a yes answer to be a correct answer has to be this. We have to be asking, are they parts of the same person? And to that question, you get a clear yes answer, right? They're both parts of the same whole. They're both parts of the same whole. Just like your left finger, your pointer on your left hand and your pointer on your right hand are both parts of your body, the same whole. So too, these two individual parts of Gage are parts of the same overall person. Right. So here's where we're at. So you have something being part of the same person as another, just in case the first is psychologically continuous with the second. Right? So Lewis's answer is a psychological answer. Psychological continuity is defined in terms of cue memories and so forth to avoid the sorts of problems Locke's view encountered. And then we've got two whole individuals being the very same person, just in case they share all their temporal parts. Okay. So how are you guys with Lewis's view? Any questions about it? Any aspects you'd like clarity on? Yeah. It's different to Locke's view in at least these two respects. First of all, Locke, he's an endurantist. So four-dimensionalism and perdurantism are quite recent in the history of philosophy. And so Locke's way of thinking about things was just in an endurantist fashion. So he implicitly believed persons to be wholly present at every point in time in which they exist. And there's no future time at which someone exists, nor earlier time at which someone exists. There's just them existing now. And then secondly, Locke adopts a view that says memory of past conscious episodes is what matters for personal identity. But that run aground of the circularity problem. And so Lewis's view is similar but different because he goes with the cue memory view, which avoids the circularity problem, quasi-memory. So those are the two major ways in which Lewis's view differs from Locke's view. And we'll see how these two, primarily the four-dimensionalist, perdurantist aspect of Lewis's view helps him avoid the transitivity problem and any problem that arises from fission that Locke actually faces. So that's what we're getting to now. Other questions about Lewis? Okay. So in the readings of Lewis, there's a lot of business about the I relation and the R relation, and these just name these two relations we've just defined. I should circle back around to that in the end. Okay. All right. So fission problem. Endurantist has fission problem because the endurantist says persons are wholly present at every time at which they exist. And if psychological continuity, right, grounds personal identity, then when B fissions into A and C, this is what follows. Right? If you say it's the psychological continuity that matters, then in a fission case you have to say B is the very same person as A. Right? B exists and is wholly present here. And when they fission, since they're psychologically continuous with A, they're wholly present here as well. And vice versa, right? A is wholly present here, right? Because they're the same person. C is psychologically continuous with B, so B is the same person as C, and so this person is who's wholly present here is also wholly present here. And since being the very same person as is transitive, right, it follows that A is the very same person as C. Right, but that can't be right. Right? These are two different people at this point. So the endurantist, right, this is just a way of highlighting the problem we've already seen, right, while observing the way in which the problem is for the endurantist. Right? We haven't talked about endurantism yet, but the presupposition of the problem is that endurantism is true. Right? And so people have responded in ways we've talked about. All right, but notice the perdurantist doesn't have this problem. Right? The perdurantist says, right, these are not whole persons. These are person parts. Right? They're stages. They're temporal parts. So A and B, yeah, they're parts of the same person, or stages of the same person. And B and C are also stages of the same person. But it doesn't follow from that fact that A and C are stages of the same person. Just because A is a part of the same thing B is a part of, and B is a part of the same thing C is a part of, it doesn't follow that A and C are parts of some further thing. Okay. Analogies, right? Here's a way of helping you appreciate this fact. Conjoined twins, right? Sometimes two individuals can be conjoined in a way, not just superficially, like the flesh on their outer arm is fused together, but they can share organs, right? So in the readings, one particular case is described of, I think it's called the Hansen twins, something with an H. And this is one pair of individuals, and you have two heads on one body, each person, and they're completely distinct persons, right? They think, two brains, two centers of consciousness. They'll have different conversations at the same time, but they share a whole lot of the same parts. I think there's one stomach, one set of intestines, the circulatory system on both, it's all connected. They have some different parts too, right? There's, or at least there's two hearts that they have, and some other parts that are duplicated. But there's a lot of shared parts as well. Two persons sharing parts. But it doesn't follow that there's just one person. You have two persons, multiple parts. Rivers can intersect, right? But you have two rivers. At the point of intersection, right, there's shared parts. But they're not the same river. Roads do this as well, right? You can have two roads that come together for a period of time and then split away, right? They overlap for a period of time. And at the point of overlap, right, they have a shared part. But they're different roads. Lewis says that when we talk about cases of fission, and fusion is discussed in the readings, when you talk about cases of fission, this is just what you have. You've got a common part being shared by two different things. Because what is a person? It's the whole thing, the collection of all the temporal parts. And it's just that there's an earlier stage, the pre-fission stage, at which two persons have a shared part. Right? So you've got, right, A and B are stages of the same person, B and C are stages of the same person, but A and C are not stages of the same person. That's not what follows from 1 and 2, right? And this is because being stages of the same person is not transitive. It means, just for the reasons we've discussed, right? Conjoined twins, intersecting roads, intersecting rivers, and so on. All right. you see this point? How fission is just not a problem on the four-dimensionalist perdurantist view? Same thing with regard to the R relation, right? So A and B might be stages of the same person. B and C might be stages of the same person. But it doesn't follow from that in the R relation that A and C are stages of the same person, right? And this is because being psychologically continuous with is not transitive, right? Just as being part of the same whole is not transitive, being psychologically continuous with is not transitive, right? That's just what you see in the fission case. You've got a case where A is psychologically continuous with B, C is psychologically continuous with B, but A is not psychologically continuous with C, right? So 3 does not follow from 1 and 2, right? So you don't have a transitivity problem. And, you know, I guess, we talked about this before, but why isn't A psychologically continuous with C? Well, notice, A and C exist at the same time, right? They're having different conscious experiences. They're not causally connected at all either. The conscious experiences of one are entirely causally disconnected from the psychological experiences of the other. There's just no easy way of maintaining that they're psychologically continuous with each other. So if psychological continuity is what binds person parts into a single person, and you don't have psychological continuity between A and C, then you're not going to have A and C being part of the same person. Okay. So, remember this earlier slide? We had this question. Suppose you know big events coming, brain surgery, big fight, something potentially highly disruptive to your brain. You want to know, or you ask the question, what matters to you on the other side? Well, one answer, psychological continuity, right? You really want to have the same memories. You want to remember who your friends are. You want to remember who your enemies are. You want to remember what you're going to do, what your duties are in life. You want to remember a lot. You don't want to become a very different person in terms of your character. But you also want to be the person on the other side, right? You don't want it to be someone else, someone distinct. You want to be the person on the other side. All right, so Parfit and Lewis give different answers. Now notice how, or at least what we need to observe is, recall how there was the problem, right? You had two different sets of characteristics of these two different relations, the identity relation and the continuity relation. And we've got to make sense of these differences, right? If we're going to say that you can say both matter in survival and that they never disagree, right? That's what Lewis wants to say. And his four-dimensionalist picture helps us with that, right? Because we've got two individuals here, right? A and B, right? They just have different collections of parts and some shared parts, right? Two individuals who share parts up to a point in time. All right, psychological continuity, right? It remains a one-many relation, but notice it's a one-many relation only between the parts, right? So this part is related by psychological continuity to these many parts. But identity remains 1-1, right? A is the same person as A. Right? Personal identity does relate A to A. Right? Personal identity is not a one-many relation here. Again, psychological continuity admits of degree, right? Parfit pre-fissioned brain is a little less psychologically continuous with these guys, but still psychologically continuous. Identity is not like that, right? Identity does not admit of degree. You're either identical to something or you're not. Clark Kent is either identical to Superman or he's not. A is identical to A, right? It's a relation that does not admit of degree, but it's a relation that holds between the whole person. transitivity fails in fission cases, right? This part is part of him, and this part is part of him, but these are not parts of each other. They're not related to each other in that way. But transitivity holds for identity, right? Recall if Clark Kent is the same as Superman, and Superman is the same person as the one loved by Lois Lane, then Clark Kent is the same person who's loved by Lois Lane. That's a relation between wholes, right? Whole persons. A is the same person as A, right? However many names you want to assign A is the same person as A. So say you name A C and you name A D, right? Doesn't matter. Transitivity is going to hold in those cases. So the four-dimensionalist, perdurantist, like Lewis, has a way of making sense of these two very different sets of properties that come together in thinking about personal identity. It's just that one column of properties applies to parts that are related by way of psychological continuity. And the other column of properties is a property of wholes that wholes have in virtue of everything being identical with itself. So we don't have the kinds of problems that endurantists have on a four-dimensionalist, perdurantist view like Lewis's. All right. Any questions about how those come together in this particular way of thinking about what individuals are? Okay. Lingering concerns. Remember William's fear argument, right? He gave us a series of 6 cases and said, should you fear? And the answer to most people is, yeah, you should fear. Okay. But you should fear only if you're the same person. Now, in those 6 cases, there's a disruption of psychological connections, right? The person who's being tortured is not psychologically continuous with the earlier person. All right, so it seems like the fact that fear is appropriate is a reason to think that psychological continuity is not where the action is. It's not what explains personal identity. Okay? So the psychological view has to be false. Lewis has done a good job dealing with the fission case. Is there anything we could say on behalf of Lewis with regard to Williams and the fear case? Is there anything we could say? All right, so notice it's a valid argument. It has 2 premises, 1 and 2. After all the changes to his brain, says premise 1, you should fear being tortured. Premise 2, you should fear being tortured only if you're the same person after such changes. All right, so if we're going to help the psychological view avoid Williams' objection, we have to challenge one of these assumptions. How much time have we got? Oh, good. Why don't you turn to the person next to you? See if you can't think of a way of putting pressure on one of these 2 assumptions. Can you think of a problem with either? Any initial thoughts on this? It's good. All right. It's quite difficult to see where to drive the wedge. Let's think about 2. All right. 2 says you should fear being tortured only if you're the same person after such changes. Now, consider a parallel case. Right? Suppose the evil genius says, if you live till you're 99, I'll torture you at that point. Should you fear being tortured? Now, I think there's a sense in which, yeah, clearly you should fear being tortured, right? Because you know you might live till you're 99. If you think 99 is way too far, just say 90, right? You know you might live to be that old. And you know if you do live to be that old, you will be tortured. And you know torture is really an unfortunate thing to endure, right, to put it mildly. So, is it appropriate to fear? It feels very counterintuitive to say it's inappropriate to fear, right? Because you know you might live till 99, so you know you might be tortured. So fear seems appropriate in light of what might be, right? In light of what you can't rule out. Well, think about the psychological view. We might be wrong about it. Right? The psychological view has a lot going for it. It explains a lot of stuff, avoids a lot of problems. The four-dimensionalist version avoids fission problems. So you might be wrong about it. But nevertheless, we have got good reason for thinking it's true. But if we are wrong, right, then we will be tortured. So if fear of torture is appropriate in the earlier case, right, where you know I might be there to be tortured, and you know you might be wrong, right, as we might be about the psychological view, then fear still seems appropriate in light of what might be, in light of what we cannot easily rule out. And this is a way of explaining how fear might be appropriate even if we've got a really plausible psychological theory that says, no, you don't exist after all the psychological disruptions. Once the evil neuroscientist erases your memories and it puts in false apparent memories, you cease to exist. Right? Still, right, we're not 100% confident in our theory, right? We've got a little bit of reason to doubt. And the fact that we know we might be wrong seems at least one way of explaining how fear could continue to be appropriate. Right? So it's not true that you should fear being tortured only if you're the same person after some such changes. Rather, what's true is it's only appropriate to fear being tortured if you know, or at least this is a bit more plausible, it's only appropriate to fear being tortured if you know you might be the same person after such changes. And that, arguably, is our situation. We might be. I mean, the psychological theory is pretty plausible. It says you're not, but, you know, we can't be 100% certain that the psychological theory is true. I might be there, and I might be the object of torture. So fear is appropriate. So this objection doesn't arguably do all the work it was intended to by Williams. It does undermine a bit of the force of some of the cases in support of the psychological view, but it doesn't do the full job. Right? There are other ways of explaining the appropriateness of the fear. Any questions about? Yeah.
Just a wondering thought. Would anything change if it were the reverse? You were told after you lose your memories or after the psychological disruption that you were tortured before then?
After, okay.
So something like you were tortured, psychological disruption, then you were told you were tortured previous to that.
So when you're told that you've already been tortured, so evil genius comes to me and says, you don't remember it, but I really tortured you. And the question is, should you fear something at that point? Only if you have reason to think he's going to do it again, I guess. Right? What's past is often easily tucked away into the past, and we needn't. It feels a bit odd to say you should fear a past event. You might fear the future consequences of the past event, but what you're fearing is not the past event, but the future consequences. All right, so one thing I want to highlight, we haven't discussed teleportation troubles and Lewis. On the slides, I've got a few questions for you to consider. Part of the reason for not discussing teleportation further is that this is a project for you in the essay if you choose to write on personal identity. It's specifically about the teleportation stuff. So there are lingering questions here. The readings direct you to some ways of thinking about it when they discuss the difference between replication and fission. And we'll just leave you to puzzle over those. So we'll see you guys later. How you doing, Rob? Good, good.
Pretty heavy.
What's that?
That all looked pretty heavy.
No, it's all fictional scenarios concerning personal identities.
Everybody, I'm Patrick.
Well, a woman from Massey on his head in his driving license photo, Jay.
This is Andre Killin, apparently.
Just touched me with his noodly appendage.
Last November, his driver's license photo was taken with the car.
He took it anyway. Oh, Chinese restaurant.
Put in there. So I'll see you right below here. See where it says more info right below this video. Click that, and I'll see you there.